Right, guys, welcome to the first episode of the kind of educational podcast that we're going to be putting together on this One Coaching YouTube account, on the podcast on the Spotify if you're listening on there. We'll be doing these alongside the sort of longer form podcast that we're doing. Should be about 20 minutes, half an hour, and we'll be going through different educational topics. So in today's topic, it's all about how to set up a dieting phase. And today we've got Ryan with us. We're going through a few different points. If you've got any questions on these whatsoever, feel free to drop us a message. And we appreciate any sort of comments, likes, any sort of support on these to try to get the message out to more people. Because at the end of the day, the main thing is we want to help as many people as possible try to get that transformation that a lot of us are looking for. So like I say, subscribe if you can. We appreciate all the support. Today's topic is going to be all on how to set up a dieting phase and setting it up so that you actually succeed. So Ryan, do you want to kick us off with the starting point?
Yeah, so I think the best place to actually start is what is your starting point. So looking at the dieting phase as a whole, what your starting point is, and then that allows you to kind of map out a plan going forward. So the main thing when a client comes to me at first is basically making sure that they're nailing everything before they go into a deficit. So whether that be their training, nutrition, recovery, making sure those variables are all nailed before heading into a deficit is going to make sure the diet's a lot more effective and probably make the diet a little bit shorter as well, rather than wasting time in the deficit. You can spend a bit of time at maintenance, maybe a small surplus, pushing food up a little bit, and then head into the deficit and make sure you're being very effective in that phase.
Yeah, there's always some sort of big rocks that I like to tick off prior to actually going into a deficit or putting my clients into a deficit. That if you can tick these off, like they're kind of the main ones that you need to say, yes, I can do that before I actually jump in. So those four span training, nutrition and recovery. Nutrition wise, you need to be making sure you're hitting your calorie target on a consistent basis. If you're not doing that, dropping more into more of a calorie deficit is just not going to work because you can't be consistent with it. Number two is actually hitting that protein intake. So getting that consistent every day. Somewhere between a gram per pound, around about that, of body weight is absolutely fine. Hit that consistently so that when you do go into that diet, it's going to be a lot easier for you to maintain recovery across the dieting phase. And then recovery wise, just make sure that your sleep hygiene is in a somewhat good spot. Make sure you're getting at least sort of 7 hours a night. Again, maximising recovery. And then finally on the training front, just make sure that you're actually training hard enough. Doing that is going to help you sort of maintain that training performance again across the dieting phase, which should help it all to be a lot more successful.
Yeah, completely agreed. I think after that as well, when you're looking at setting up the plan, you kind of got to understand what your end goal is as well. So if a client wants to get into like really, really good condition where they're sub 10% body fat and say they're not at a level where they could do that all in one stint, I often say like you don't really want to be pulling off more than 10 to 15% of your body weight in one go. So understanding your starting point and then understanding what your end point is as well. And then they're basically creating a plan of action to get from the start point to the end point, potentially by having like diet breaks in the middle or periods of actually reversing food up in a surplus in the middle, can basically make it a lot more effective in the long run rather than trying to do it all in one stint, which is going to end up basically you dieting on very, very low food, very, very high expenditure to keep yourself in a deficit basically.
Yeah, so with that, I guess that leads on to like the timeline rate of loss side of things.
Yeah.
Because if you've got loads to lose, like you say, you probably need to split it up. And with that, you need to actually set out a timeline that you will be able to follow to actually succeed. So, like you say, diet breaks. I know you applied that quite well throughout your prep to sort of manage that fatigue going through.
Yeah, so in my prep, I pretty much used the diet breaks alongside deloads, because you've got to kind of remember that there's going to be different forms of stresses. So you're going to have a stress from training, a stress from the deficit, and then general life stresses as well. And if you can manage those all in the same week, I think that's probably the most effective way of managing fatigue throughout a whole diet. So that's what I did. I think I ran 2 diet breaks in the whole prep, and then I started to implement high days as well. And then in those diet breaks, I either run a deload, where it's complete time off training, or a devolume. So I'm basically having that reset from training, dropping off a lot of stress from that side of things, alongside the stress from the diet, and that puts you in a position where you're a lot more fresh going back into the deficit the next week. And that really helped throughout the whole prep, making me feel a bit more normal towards the end as well. I think I could have been in a much worse position.
Just for the people that aren't sure what a diet break is, do you want to sort of explain how you'd execute that and the reasons why you might jump into a diet break?
Yeah, of course. So with a diet break, it's going to depend on what deficit you were in before. So if you were in quite an aggressive deficit, you can probably afford to push your food up a little bit more. But say you're basically in a deficit of losing around £1 per week, all you're going to do is push your food up to maintenance, which is going to be about a 500 calorie increase from that. Spend the week at maintenance. Usually what I say is you probably want to push carbs up as much as possible. That's going to have the biggest impact on performance the following week. You can keep protein at pretty much a minimum, a baseline. So you're looking at like 20 grams of complete protein per meal. And then fats as well, you can probably keep it at a baseline. The reason why you can get away with having the fats and proteins lower is because of the short amount of time you're in that position. You don't want to keep proteins and fats low when you're in a long-term deficit because of the negative effects of doing that from a hormonal standpoint from the fats and then from a muscle mass standpoint for the protein. So you can get away with doing it for a short amount of time in a diet break, for example, fill up as much as possible, increase your intramuscular glycogen, and therefore you're going back into the deficit with a bit more oomph behind your training because you're basically got more carbs behind you as well.
Yeah, exactly. Then second thing in terms of that timeline side of things is obviously a lot of the guys that we'll be working with and a lot of the guys watching this are going to be going on holidays, wanting to have a few meals out throughout that diet. You're not going to be able to be 100%. We talk about a lot how the majority of the people don't need to be 100% in. Fair enough, if you're on a bodybuilding prep or if you've got some really, really high aspirational goals, you probably need to be. But for the most part, people will be going on social occasions and holidays. So a few tips on how to, actually put that into your timeline. I guess that is the first tip. Actually put it into your timeline so that you're sort of planning out that week, or whether it's a week on holiday or going out for a meal or whatever, actually plan it in, because then you can start to make adjustments around that social occasion. So a few things that I've done throughout my diet, I wasn't doing any sort of contest prep, so I allowed myself a little bit more flexibility, was actually planning ahead for those holidays. So I sort of knew I probably wasn't going to be losing much weight throughout that holiday. So it was like, okay, let's be more aggressive when I can be. Prior to the holiday, being pretty aggressive with the diet, so that I almost give myself a little bit of room in terms of the rate of loss to say, okay, I'm happy for this 1 or 2 week to be a little bit slower. So that's kind of holidays. Do you want to cover like meals out, social occasions, what you do on that front?
Yeah, I think something to add to what you said as well about the holidays is rather than seeing them as like a setback on your diet, see them in a positive light. So see them as a diet break, a bit of a time to press the reset button, recover a little bit from the diet and then go back in, rather than seeing them as like basically time off the diet. You can see them as a diet break, and lining up the diet break with the holiday pretty much makes the most sense. With regards to social occasions, I think you need to understand, like, can you fit it into your macros? Because at the end of the day, say you run a meal plan most days and you just want to track one day, and if you're still hitting your calorie goal, you're still going to be in a deficit for the day, and therefore you're still going to be losing weight. And a lot of the time, you really can do that if you try and plan ahead. Basically, the day before, you plan ahead what you're going to eat, what you're going to drink. You can really fit it into your macros, unless your food is really, really low, say below like 1,800 calories. You definitely can just have protein meals throughout the day. Maybe have 3 protein meals throughout the day, so you're saving a big bolus of calories for that social occasion at the night, and therefore you're still sticking to your calorie goal through the day, and therefore you're not really taking anything away from your diet in the long run. But also, if you are having to have like basically a couple of days where you are definitely going off plan and going to have a few more calories, at the end of the day, that doesn't really matter. If you plan ahead and make sure that you're giving yourself more than enough time in the diet, a couple of days, say in a surplus, a couple of days at maintenance isn't going to take away from the diet at all. If anything, it's going to add a couple of days onto the end of the diet, and big deals. At the end of the day, it's only a couple of days.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing on planning ahead as well is, like, don't kid yourself. If you are going out for a meal, realistically, unless you can track it, if it's something like Nando's, you can use MyFitnessPal, track it. It's really easy. But if you're just going to a pub, realistically, you're going to be having at least 1,000 calories. Unless you're choosing just a small start or whatever, it is going to probably be more than you expect. So give yourself a little bit of wiggle room, or else you're just going to be kidding yourself throughout that. So that's kind of the that's kind of the plan of action timeline thing covered. Do you want to just cover how you might finish it off, how you might finish off that timeline, how you might finish off the diet?
Yeah, so something you can like take from a bodybuilding prep into a lifestyle prep where you're just prepping for a holiday or a photo shoot, whatever it is you probably don't want to be finishing the diet in quite an aggressive deficit where you're basically digging quite hard, expenditure is quite high, food's quite low, because that's not really going to create your best look, because intramuscularly you're going to be quite flat, your glycogen stores aren't going to be full basically. From a stress standpoint, you're going to be holding quite a lot of water extracellularly as well, and therefore the look's not going to be quite as crisp as you might want it. And also the inflammation coming from the expenditure and training side of things is not going to create the best look at the end of the day. So what I'd usually say is try and plan ahead in terms of the timeline and have 1 to 2 weeks before you want your peak look. So say your peak look is for a photo shoot or a holiday, have 1 to 2 weeks before that time where you can taper up food, taper up carbs to make sure that you're full intramuscularly. That's going to make you look a lot better. It's going to make you look leaner as well. And then also taper down expenditure and training as well. So run like a devolume, a deload in that final couple of weeks. It's probably going to make you look a lot better.
Yeah, well, that's also going to do, if you are going on a holiday, is at the end of your diet, you're going to be pretty hungry. So it's quite good to have those 1 to 2 weeks prior to your holiday to have a little bit more food, pull down that appetite a little bit. And then you'll go on holiday and you won't be wanting to just eat everything in sight, which is like, it's very easily done. So I definitely recommend just giving yourself time, giving yourself 1 to 2 weeks prior to whatever that end goal is.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think if I went straight on a holiday after my prep, it would have been a nightmare. Like, I would have just been eating everything in sight. So yeah, having a couple of weeks at least.
Yeah, I've definitely been there. Been there myself. Cool. So that's the timeline covered. Now it's kind of going on to how to actually execute it. So first things first, you've started the timeline. You've set your calorie target in terms of where your maintenance is. Now you need to make an adjustment to actually get into a calorie deficit. And there's sort of 2 ways to do that. You can either go down the route of pulling down nutrition, so pulling down the amount of calories you consume in each day, or increasing the amount of expenditure, generally either through increasing cardio or increasing the amount of steps that you're doing. Initially, I always like to be fairly aggressive out the gate. It does take some oomph to actually get the ball rolling. So obviously it does depend on where your current calories are at. But I like to pull down at least 500 from that sort of initial set point to actually get the ball rolling in terms of weight loss. Simply because you can be aggressive at the start. When you've got a little bit more fat on you, there's no harm in actually pulling off the weight pretty speedy. And I think you'd probably agree with you, Ryan.
Yeah, 100%. That's a mistake I've made in the past with clients, and it just comes with experience that once you're, say you're in a phase before, when you're in a gaining phase and you're pushing up food so much, your body's probably going to be hyper adapted to that food by the end of it. And therefore, as soon as you pull back food, your body's probably just going to adapt to that new calorie intake, and therefore the deficit you might think you're in, you might not actually be in. So I usually say like between 25 and 30% of the calorie intake, just drop that straight away, because you can afford to be very aggressive at the start of the diet. You've got a much lower propensity to lose muscle. You've got high levels of training performance. You've got more fat attached to your body, which you can use for energy. And therefore, there's no need for this big amount of food coming in at the start of the diet. Preferably, you'd actually be able to up your food towards the end of the diet when you need that food, because you're leaner and therefore haven't got basically leverages to performance. So yeah, I completely agree with that, 100%.
Yeah, so what that will end up looking like is, even though you sort of set out this rate of loss as quite a, I'm starting here, I'm finishing here, what's the rate of loss that I need to do? Probably what it's actually going to look like is sort of sweeping underneath that rate of loss a little bit faster towards the start. Then as you get towards the end of that diet, to the back end of it, you're probably going to level off a little bit. They call it sort of like landing the plane. If you imagine a plane coming into land, it's pretty aggressive, pretty steep to start off with, and then when it's actually landing, there's not that much decrease. So definitely worth doing if you are jumping into a diet, to go out aggressively, which should sort of reduce stress towards the back end of that diet.
Yeah, 100% I agree. I think the next thing you probably look at in terms of setting up your nutrition is where you're going to pull that food from. So usually at the end of a gaining phase or the end of the previous phase, you're probably going to have quite a lot of carbs in every single meal because your food's going to be quite high. But I think the main thing to do when you go into a deficit is pulling foods basically as far away from training as possible. So whether that be your first meal of the day or your last meal of the day, try and pull the majority of your food away from there. And therefore, you're still keeping a lot of carb intake around your training window to try and maximise performance, especially towards the start of the diet.
Yeah, so just around that, if you've not heard of sort of like Peri workout nutrition or nutrition around your training window, the purpose of that is to be able to fuel that training session so that you can maintain or even progress your training throughout that diet, and still get good pumps, still be well energized in the gym. So again, the idea behind that is try to have as many carbohydrates as you can around that training window. Having that last meal maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours before you actually train, and have it fairly high in carbohydrate so that when you actually do get into the gym, like I say, you're going to be able to keep that performance high. I know throughout my diet, I kept in 3 bagels pre-training, which it made the rest of my food quite low, but it was worthwhile.
Were they bagel thins or full bagels?
2 full bagels, 1 thin.
Fucking hell.
Jam as well. Jam.
Yeah. I've got 2 bagels pre-workout now, but that's because my food's high. I couldn't do that in a diet. Even if that did have benefits to performance, it'd just be punishing to yourself in the evening.
Yeah, I was training early in the morning as well, so a bit rough, but I'd look forward to it.
Yeah.
Cool, so that's changes around nutrition. I think the bulk of that deficit does come from actually changes in your nutrition. Like I mentioned earlier, the other sort of methods are increasing the amount of steps you're doing and increasing the amount of cardio you're doing to actually increase that expenditure. Again, I think you'd probably agree that increasing your expenditure from steps and cardio isn't going to be the main driver of that deficit. It is going to mainly come from your food. That being said, it does give you a little bit more. So in terms of a starting point, what I always like to do is set in a routine with cardio. So it doesn't have to be loads, but saying to yourself, right, I'm just going to do 10 minutes after each session is going to allow you to then increase later on, and it gets you into the routine of finishing your session, you're getting on the bike, getting on the Stairmaster, whatever it is, and it becomes very much a habit, which means when you get further into your diet, you don't suddenly have to add in like half an hour of cardio, which is going to be very, very hard to adapt to. So that's definitely one thing I like to do. Just trickle in a little bit of cardio at the start to kind of get that habitual practice going.
Yeah, I completely agree on that. Like having a baseline amount in right at the start. Usually I just do like rest day cardio to start off with, but just at least having some in there so it's not a shock to the client when they actually have cardio put in. They're already in routine from doing it in the past, and therefore all they're doing is a little bit more cardio on a day-to-day basis. So yeah, completely agree with that. I think later on down the line in a diet, I don't actually like pushing cardio too high, because I think the thing I found with clients as well is that if you push cardio too high, it doesn't really increase the deficit. Basically, the client will just become a lot more lethargic outside of that cardio window, that training window, and therefore their total energy expenditure for the day isn't actually that much higher by pushing cardio so high. So usually I really wouldn't like to push cardio more than like 30 minutes a day. That's pretty much the max that I'd like to do. And then after that, I'd like to pull more from food. The main benefit of actually having expenditure higher is that you can keep more food in and therefore keep more food around your workout, which is going to basically leverage more performance. So that's the main reason why I'd have expenditure in, but I wouldn't usually push it too high. Do you know what your thoughts are on that as well?
Yeah, I completely agree with the expenditure. Anything above half an hour, like you suddenly start going, oh, I'll add in another 5, I'll add in another 5. It actually just doesn't make a difference.
Yeah,
you'll notice that you'll add in that cardio and you're like, why is that not working? It's actually
you're dead for the rest of the day.
Overdoing it.
Yeah, 100%.
You literally just turn into a vegetable for the rest of the day. So definitely try and avoid that. And then other form of expenditure is obviously through steps. Now, a lot of people will just go, right, do 10k steps as soon as you start the deficit, and that's so like just plucked out of thin air. It's definitely not applicable to everyone. That started off with, I think it was a political move in Japan. It was like a 10k step thing that they started, and then it's just like flooded into the fitness industry. So in terms of like actually setting out your steps and probably what I'd recommend, again, where are you actually starting? What's your starting point? What do you naturally do? If you've not been tracking, your phone will tell you anyway. So go onto the health app if you've got an iPhone, and it will tell you how many steps you're getting. If you're naturally getting sort of 5,000 on a usual day pre-deficit, just increase by about 2,000, and that will again get the ball rolling. So then later down the line, you can just add in two, to kind of keep that deficit moving.
Yeah, I agree. I think steps can be such a useful tool, but just because they're such low impact, and therefore they have the least crossover to training and the impact on recovery for training. So if a client does have the time availability, then I will push steps quite high. So for example, with Ellie, I asked her, well, how would you like to create the deficit? And because she's got quite a lot of time on her hands, she wants to do more steps, which is like completely fine. It's going to allow you to increase expenditure quite a lot, not actually have too much of an impact on NEAT because it's so low demanding. It's not going to make you too much more lethargic throughout the rest of the day, and it's going to have pretty much no effect on performance whatsoever. So I do really like pushing steps. I wouldn't usually go much higher than like 15k, because I think at that point it can start to have an impact on recovery, but pushing steps quite high if they have the time availability is quite important. But also at the same time, understanding if a client doesn't have the time availability, you might want to go to cardio or lower food, because those are more time efficient ways of creating a deficit basically.
Yeah, I think as well with steps, they're really good for sort of setting you into a routine, knowing that you get up, you get outside, do some steps. It's going to help your circadian rhythm as well with sleep. And again, just setting it into that routine, getting into like a really obvious pattern each day just makes it so much easier.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the next thing we can probably move on to is training, how training is impacted by heading into a deficit. And I think there is definitely some changes that do need to be made to try and make sure training is as effective as possible. But on the whole, your training style shouldn't really change. So whether you've been training with reps in reserve before, training to failure before, that style of training shouldn't really change, because at the end of the day, that's what built you the muscle, and therefore you need to keep it pretty much the same to try and maintain that muscle. Keep the intensity the same to maintain that muscle. A lot of people think, let's push up the rep ranges, let's try and tone the muscles. I know it's quite a big thing in, let's say, the general population, but at the end of the day, there's no reason why you shouldn't be keeping training pretty much the exact same from an intensity standpoint.
Yeah, especially straight out the gate. You're not suddenly gonna drop your recovery capacity by loads as soon as you start dieting. You might notice it reduced towards the back end or throughout the middle of that diet, but at the start, literally, I wouldn't change anything, and almost be reactive to your training rather than thinking of trying to be too proactive. So if you are noticing that your recovery starts to go downhill a little bit, that's when you can make changes. But don't go, oh, next week I'm not going to be able to recover, so let's make a load of changes to reduce that, because you just don't know. So definitely give yourself time to make changes around your training. And if you are making them, just be slow with it. Like, you don't need to suddenly go, new movement there, because if anything, that's going to make your recovery worse.
Yeah, so I think understanding when your recovery is going to change as well, it's not going to suddenly be impacted, and you're not going to suddenly have to do half the amount of sets you were doing previously. It's going to be a very slow process throughout the whole deficit, simply because your food's getting lower, your expenditure's getting higher, and therefore there's another recovery demand coming from that as well. And then also you're getting leaner, which is going to make it a little bit harder to recover as well. And therefore it's just going to be tapering down your volume over time, very slowly, just pulling out a set here or there. When you feel like a set just isn't very effective anymore, you're not training effectively from that set, that's when I'll probably look to take it out. Just analysing your performance, analysing your soreness as well, and using all of that data to understand when to pull volume down slightly.
Yeah, I think that relates to the diet and just like general training as well.
Yeah.
The best way to see if you are actually recovering is look at your numbers. See where your performance is going, whether that's the load on the bar, the reps, whatever you're getting. As long as your execution is staying the same, have a look at where your numbers are going. If they're maintaining or even still progressing throughout the diet, there's probably not any need to change anything. As long as you're keeping that execution the exact same. especially with sort of pressing, for example, it's very easy to just sort of like start lifting your chest up a little bit more on the overhead press, getting your chest involved, lifting that sternum up, and then suddenly that overhead press is turning into a lower pec press.
Yeah.
So just make sure your execution is staying the same throughout that deficit.
Yeah, so making sure you're filming your training throughout as well, so you can compare your lifts on a week-to-week basis to make sure, if you think about it, if your execution's maintaining over time and the load is staying the same as well, that internal stimulus is going to stay the same as well. But if you're starting to use other things like momentum to make sure you're maintaining the lifts, then the actual internal stimulus you're getting from each set is going to be decreasing over time. And the external load, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. What matters in terms of holding onto muscle or building more muscle is making sure that internal stimulus is maintaining or slowly increasing. So yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about if the external load drops slightly, because at the end of the day, it probably is going to drop towards the end of the diet, just due to, firstly, your leverages. Having less fat around certain body parts is going to make the range of motion slightly more. So for example, on a press, you're probably going to be having slightly more range of motion because you've simply got less fat around your chest, around your back, and then also stability. So as you diet down, you're going to lose fat around joints, and that's going to create less stability with the movement patterns, and therefore you can't create quite as much force, and inevitably numbers will drop slightly.
Yeah, so just to kind of explain, if anyone doesn't know, internal stimulus is simply like the tension that you're putting on the muscle, or at least the target muscle that you're trying to train. So you're just trying to keep that the same. And doing things like increased momentum, like you mentioned, is going to reduce that internal stimulus because you're taking tension off that target muscle that you're actually doing. I think that's everything covered in terms of training. Would you add anything else on there?
Yeah, potentially some changes to movement selection. I think it's something you can look into, especially with like free weight movements. You've got to kind of remember, I need to keep the intensity there. And if you find yourself at a point where you can't stabilise movement patterns and you can't really take it anywhere close to true muscular failure, you might be failing for other reasons, or you can't actually target the muscle effectively. You might want to look at swapping out some free weight movements for more stable movement patterns. So for example, swapping a incline dumbbell press to an incline Smith press might be a good idea, just to make sure you can provide the muscle with the stimulus it needs to maintain, basically.
Yeah, and again, just relating to that first point, you don't need to change it if it's still working. So until you do start to notice some decreases in stability, and perhaps you get into the end of your set and you're thinking, I swear I should have got one more rep there because you just lost stability. That's when you might look at changing that dumbbell press to a machine press or more guided path of motion in whatever the piece of kit you're using to increase stability and therefore actually be able to take that muscle to true muscular failure, like you said.
Yeah, I think the main takeaway from all of that training side of things is just making sure your training stays as effective as possible. You don't really want to be doing much junk volume. While you could probably get away with it in a gaining phase when you've got a surplus of calories coming in, when you're in a deficit and recovery is going to be a factor that's going to influence your performance, you really want to make sure that all your training is very effective.
Yeah, exactly. I believe that's everything covered.
Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Cool, so just a bit of a recap. Obviously, the starting point is really important. So get yourself locked into a good routine with nutrition, recovery, training, etc. Number 2 is create a plan of action. So make sure you've got a timeline in place that sets out exactly what you're going to be doing throughout that diet. If you've got holidays, if you've got social occasions, put that into that timeline. Then number 3 was changes to nutrition and expenditure. You're going to have to reduce food. It's probably going to be the main driver. And then also trickling up steps and cardio will be a good idea. And then finally, just like we covered, the change to training. Make changes if you need to, if things aren't going well with your performance. So yeah, that's kind of a recap of the podcast. I do hope you guys enjoyed listening. If you've enjoyed this, be sure to subscribe, drop a comment if you've got any questions whatsoever, and also let us know what topics you'd like for us to cover on the following weeks. If you have found this helpful, this is exactly what we take clients through in our One Coaching service. We help people transform their physiques and we get elite level transformations. You can ask any of our clients, that's exactly what we do. So if you are interested, there'll be a link underneath this podcast, underneath this YouTube video for you to apply to coaching. We'll be in touch very shortly after that. And if you do apply, we'll be very excited to start working with you to get that elite level transformation. So yeah, thank you guys for listening. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one. Ciao.